welcome to tonight's open classroom. Tonight we move from several weeks of having discussed the economy and globalization to the considerations of security concerns and globalization. Tonight's guest speaker is Professor Denis Sullivan. Professor Sullivan is founder of Dialogue of Civilizations Project, director of the International Affairs Program here at Northeastern, and also the Middle Eastern Center. He served as an advisor to the U.S. Department of State, a consultant to the World Bank on several occasions, and has even served as an election observer in Morocco. He's written extensively on Middle Eastern affairs with a concentration on Egypt and Palestine, and so would you all please welcome Professor Sullivan.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to, I think unlike probably all the other, or most of the other topics in this series, I want to take us back a little bit into history. And I'll explain that as I go along. One of the, I guess there's two primary points I'm going to make, as you can see from my slightly adjusted title, from what I initially thought. This is a global war from day one. Defining when day one is, I think we have a little discussion to talk about. But at any point, at least in the last 120 years, we can look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or the Palestine-Zionism conflict, and we can see that it has global reach and global impact. If there's a massacre of Jews or a massacre of Palestinians going on in Israel-Palestine, the world gets mobilized much more quickly than if there's a massacre and when there's a massacre in Rwanda. We might eventually get mobilized regarding Rwanda, but moments after any massacre, any horrors, any tragedies, and any praiseworthy activities like signing peace agreements of all things, those rare moments that they are, we again, as a world community, get mobilized, take sides, or sometimes sing Kumbaya. Well, maybe not often on that. But again, I want to talk, I want to go through some history, but again, let's start not where we are today, but let's start from days after 9/11. And this is a cartoon depicting President George W. Bush talking to then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, saying, "Prime Minister Sharon, President Bush here. Hi. An agreement in the Middle East would be helpful in our war on terrorism. But as I said during the campaign, any agreements have to be on your timetable. I'm just calling to tell you what your timetable is." And the point of this, dare I say, comic, in days after our national tragedy, our global tragedy, is to point out that so many things in the Middle East are interconnected. And we'll talk about that at length. Similarly, when President Obama took office, as you all know, one of the main things he was focused on was having a reboot, if you will, of American Middle East relations, American Muslim relations, American Arab relations. And so here is his speech in June, I think it was June 4th, in fact, of 2009, less than a year ago even. He went to Cairo to make his speech to the Muslim world, he called it. So let's just take a quick look at this.
For decades then, there has been a stalemate. Two peoples with legitimate aspirations, each with a painful history that makes compromise elusive. It's easy to point fingers. For Palestinians to point to the displacement brought about by Israel's founding, and for Israelis to point to the constant hostility and attacks throughout its history, from within its borders as well as beyond. But if we see this conflict only from one side or the other, then we will be blind to the truth. The only resolution is for the aspirations of both sides to be met through two states where Israelis and Palestinians each live in peace and security. That is in Israel's interest, Palestine's interest, America's interest, and the world's interest. And that is why I intend to personally pursue this outcome with all the patience and dedication that the task requires. The obligations that the parties have agreed to under the roadmap are clear. For peace to come, it is time for them and all of us to live up to our responsibilities. Palestinian.
We can go on and on about that. We can come back to that if you'd like. My point is that when President Obama recognized that he needed to do his world tour to restart America's relations with the entire world, one, he chose Egypt to deliver his message to the Muslim world. Now, not all Arabs are Muslim, not all Muslims are Arab, certainly, but he chose the heart of the Arab world and one of the primary, most important cities in all of the Muslim world. And so he chose to do that, to speak about why America needs to focus on Israel and Palestine for everything else that the world that he has to do in the world. And again, we'll come back to that. But he did mention American national interests. We will focus on American national interests, but not primarily, because all of these things are intersected with international security. And so I like to start with a lot of questions anyway. You can go through the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the contemporary issues of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and most people like to make statements about what is true and what is right and who is right and who is wrong. I like instead to ask a lot of questions to help us kind of peel away some of the layers. So whose interests come first in the Arab-Israeli conflict? Again, this is not something... Oh, got it. This is not something, again, I want to answer with you at the moment, but let's think about some questions. Including who's directing events. Is the United States directing events in the Arab-Israeli conflict? Is the world community? Is the United Nations? Is the European Union? President Obama mentioned the roadmap, as if everyone knows what the roadmap is. I mean, if you are a devotee of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you know what the roadmap is. It's George Bush's attempt to say we will have a roadmap to a two-state solution. Of course, we never got started on that road. But even Obama has to make reference to it, or had to. Who's spearheading resolution of it? Is President Obama? Is Hillary Clinton? Is George Mitchell, the special ambassador for the president in the Middle East, is he spearheading these? And who, of course, is working against resolution? Who suffers from the lack of resolution? Who gains from the ongoing conflict? And should Americans care? Well, I'm assuming you do, that's why you're here. If we do care, why do we care? Is it interpersonal? Is it personal? Are we Jewish? Are we Muslim? Are we Arab? Are we simply humane and we care? What is our caring about? And then, perhaps more important, how should we care? How should we take our compassion, our passion, our sympathy, perhaps our empathy? How do we direct it as global citizens? And certainly, if I'm assuming most of us are citizens of the United States, at any rate, we're all citizens of the world, who do we push to have an impact? I'm often asked, this conflict is just so, it's been there for thousands of years, people like to say. I like to say it's been there for about 110 or 115 years. But nevertheless, it's interesting how small a space this is, and again, how so much of our attention is focused on this tiny plot of land. And we can call it Israel-Palestine, but if you just look at the relative size of Israel and Palestine, and by Israel I mean the 1948 borders after the 48 War. I'll show you a map of what I mean in just a second. But if you look at the 1948 to 1967 borders and call that Israel, today the population is about 6.6 million people, 80% of whom are Jewish, nearly 20% of whom are Palestinian Arab, both Muslim primarily and some Christian. So in other words, 1.2 million out of that 6.6 million of Israelis are actually Arab, Muslim, and Christian. The landmass, again, think New Jersey. Jump over the green line and the security barrier, or the apartheid wall, or whatever you like to call it these days. Jump over the green line at least, and you'll see the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. In other words, what presumably will be a Palestine state. And you see about 3.7 million Palestinians in West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And when you think of the landmass, think Delaware and DC. If you combine these two populations across the green line into Israel, Palestine, into Israel and into Palestine, of course, there's about 300,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and 0 now in Gaza. But if you think about these two combined peoples, you see that the populations today are about 51% Israeli Jewish, about 5.2 million people, and the Palestinians are about 4.9 million people today. Now I have this lengthy quote from the Jewish Agency, who says that by 2020 there will be more Arabs than Jews between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This dry statistic, according to many, has only one meaning. If Israel keeps the West Bank and Gaza under its control, it will have to choose between two painful options, either losing its Jewish character or ceasing to be a democratic state. That is, if Israel wants to remain both Jewish and democratic, it has to pull out of the territories in which presently reside some 3.5 million Palestinians. The Arabs are assured of becoming a demographic majority in what is now Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, with just the regular natural population growth. Sorry, did I skip one? So if you zoom out and you look again at the Jersey and the DC and the Delaware of the Middle East, you can see in relation to the other Arab states that surround it, how small this enclave really is. But nevertheless, in many ways, it's far more important. So I just want to throw this map up to scare you, because it's now the time for the history lesson. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire in 1481. And you can see there's no reference along you see Egypt, and if you just go north of Egypt and go up toward where you probably know Israel is now, you don't see Israel, nor do you see the word Palestine, you do see the word Syria. So again, my point is that just in using this, is we're going to go back in history and we're going to see that at many different points along the way, there was a Jewish kingdom, and then there wasn't. There was a Syrian enclave, there was a Syrian territory in which there was a Palestine. Then there was an Ottoman Empire, and that was gone. And we're going to, again, show you some maps. But the core of this conflict, as I've mentioned, is about 113 years old. Why do I choose that date? In 1897, there was a World Zionist Congress that declared the need for a Jewish homeland. We'll get into that in a second. But again, the core of this conflict is that you have one piece of land, one set of real estate. And yet you have two peoples both claiming absolute legitimate rights to that land. You have Eretz Yisrael and you have Philistine. You have the land of Israel and you have Palestine. And so you have this one joint history for, okay, that we can call 2 millennia. No problem. There are millennia of history between Israelis, the descendants of these people who are now Israelis and Palestinians, yes, separated, especially after the diaspora of the Jews and the expulsion of the Jews from the land of Israel in the late 1st century, and the reclamation of those Jews back to their ancient historic homeland, and yet, oh, by the way, who are all these Palestinians? So that joint history, and then 2 separate but still ever entangled history. You can look before 1948, which is the starting point of the modern state of Israel, and you can see a local conflict, and yet, as I maintain, one that is often directed from the outside, at this point in time, by Great Britain more than anybody. You had the 1948 war, which regionalized the Palestine-Zionism conflict into an Arab-Israeli conflict. You had the 56 war that I'm going to talk a lot about tonight, that turned this into a global conflict in which even the Soviet Union had mobilized nuclear weapons. You had the 1967 Six-Day War. You had the 69 to 70 war, the 73 war, 78, 82, 87 intifada. Oh, there's peace processes. But where did that end up? Oh, another intifada, another war on terror. On and on and on. That core of the conflict isn't going away. There's one future for Palestinians and Israelis. The absolute fundamental problem is how do we get to that one future? And what's it look like? Is it a positive one or not? I mentioned layers, and forgive me, but I was a fan of Shrek at the time. And he, if you remember him walking with the donkey, he talked about, you know, Shrek, onions have layers and ogres have layers. And in fact, the Arab-Israeli conflict is a stinky ogre. No, that's not my point. The Arab-Israeli conflict also has its layers. It has historic layers, it has its current layers. For instance, just look at Israel. Look at Israel today. You have leftists, you have rightists, you have centrists, you have observant Jews, you have secular Jews, you have anti-Zionist Jews. You look at Arab layers. You have Egyptian, Jordanian, Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, Iraqi, it's Saudi, it's Libyan, Algeria, it's on and on and on. You have Palestinian layers. You have Fatah, the main grouping within the PLO. You have the anti-Fatah, which is basically everybody else. You have Hamas, the Islamic movement against Fatah. You have other such acronyms like the PFLP, which barely exist anymore, but my point is they continue to subdivide the Palestinian people. Just as the Israeli community is so diverse and so many different communities, so too is the Palestinian. You have American layers. You have Democrats and Republicans all over the map as to how they support Israel or how they might speak for Palestinian rights. You have governmental layers. You have the State Department, at odds often with the Defense Department, at odds often with the National Security Council, at odds often with others in the governmental bureaucracy. You certainly have NGOs. You have human rights organizations. You have lobbies. You have the pro-Israel lobby. You have the pro-Palestinian lobby, or the pro-Arab lobby, et cetera, et cetera. You definitely have global layers. You have the role of the United Nations from 1947 to today. You have the European Union, which has taken on a up and down, it fluctuates how involved it really is. You have the United States forever, since 1946, and actually even well before that. You have Russia sometimes. You have the Third World, or whatever we call it these days. You have that sometimes as well. But as I said, this is a globalized conflict from day one. Now you can quibble with my choosing 1897 as day one, that's fine. But let's just drop, my point is if you drop into the conflict at any point in the last 113 years, you will see that the global reach of the conflict, that other people outside Israel and Palestine are directing events or trying to, and you have people inside Israel and Palestine quite often doing what people like to talk about, you know, dogs wag their tails, right? But then sometimes you have these animals called the tail wagging the dog. In many cases, you often have events in Israel-Palestine wagging the rest of the world, or directing us. So, 1897 is the starting point for the birth of modern-day Zionism, and the rise of Zionism. And from that moment to the establishment of Israel in 1948, you had waves of Jewish immigration. We talk about 5 waves of aliyot, or aliyah, the going up to Jerusalem, or in other words, making aliyah, going to a higher place, elevating your personal status, elevating your emotional, spiritual self, and your physical being by going. That's making aliyah. So from the early 1900s through 1948, you had these different waves of immigration. This was all driven by what we call modern-day Zionism. And this was largely Eastern and Western European Jews who fled pogroms in Poland and Russia, or later the Soviet Union, anti-Semitism, whether it's in Paris or Vienna or Germany and the Holocaust or England or whatever. So those different waves, that all emanated because those wonderful Christian communities in Europe treated non-Christians so nicely, and Jews in particular. So that is a combination of a desire for a return to the ancient homeland and an actual motivation for the physical well-being of oneself and one's family. I'll talk at length a little bit about World War I and the various machinations of the British and the French in particular. I love to beat up on the British. They're such easy targets in this conflict. You look at the 1936 Arab Uprising, for instance, or the Arab Revolt, which led to a report by Great Britain which talked about taking what they had taken out of World War I, which again I'll show you a map in a second, and subdividing it even further. So if there's a revolt, my point is if there's a massacre in Hebron, if there is a revolt in Jerusalem, the British colonial powers will come in and just redraw the map yet again. This will make more sense when I show you the maps. 48, just look at when Israel declared its independence in May 1948, the Soviet Union and the United States were rushing to be the first one to recognize this new state. I think the United States beat the Russians, the Soviets, by 7 minutes or something. The 1956 war, again, it's a unique situation where actually the United States took the lead for a positive result. Get into that at length. As I say, this, this is a talk about dropping in at any point in time. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go through two main points, World War I and the 1956 conflict, talk about other events, because, as I say, no matter where we drop in, we're going to find the global reach of this conflict and affecting our daily lives, affecting American elections, affecting UN policies, etc. But I want to also just mention there's also a flip side of this. The world around often uses the Israel-Palestine conflict as their way of justifying their own actions. And so when Saddam Hussein rallied his troops in August 1990 and said, he didn't say we're going to Kuwait to pick up some more oil fields and to take over the riches of Kuwait. No, he said, we're going to liberate Palestine. And his troops were, woohoo, rally, let's go. And then they just kind of went south into Kuwait. And they're like, what are we doing here? Jerusalem's that way. So even Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden will utilize and manipulate the Israel-Palestine conflict for their, I don't sound like George Bush, evil deeds. But there we are. So as I say, the origins of the modern Middle East and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict really are the same. That same origin. I mentioned the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland. In World War I, Britain, France, Russia, and Austria, Hungary, Germany, and the Ottomans, they're all at war. And the Ottoman Empire was on its last turban or something. It was on its last legs. And the British and the French knew that, and so did the Germans. And so there was already pre-planning. See, in those days, when they fought a war, they knew what they wanted at the end of that war. Not like now. They planned for something when the eventuality of defeat of their opponent happened. So actually, but what they also did was they set up 3 different alternatives. So the British and French, let me just focus on those bad guys. In 1915, the British were promising the Arabs an Arab state. You help us defeat the Turks, you fight a 5th column from within the Ottoman Empire, you, Sharif Hussein, and your 2 wonderful sons, Abdullah and Faisal, you fight with us, the British, against the Ottomans, and when we defeat them together, we'll support you in an Arab state. Sounds good. Sign the letter. Actual documents, written, promises. Wonderful. Then in 1916, the British and French said, hey, when we defeat these guys with the help of the Arabs, we'll just carve up the Middle East ourselves, and you get this color, and I get that color. I'll show you the colors in a minute. And then not to be, leave it at that, when the Zionist movement was putting pressure on the British government to support the new Zionist cause, the British said, sure, we support a home for the Jewish people, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. That doesn't seem to contradict anything else they've said, so they thought. When it became clear that there was all of this hypocrisy and contradiction, actually Faisal, one of the sons of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, got together with the leader of the World Zionist Organization, with Chaim Weizmann, and said, okay, well, we can accommodate a Jewish home within this greater Arab state. We can do that. We Arabs, we Muslims have lived with Jews